Hello, everyone. Thank you for stopping by. So this is actually a follow-up to the original Emergent meeting talk um, from Professor Kuiken. And I'm exploring a structural equation model, really path analysis, focusing on emergent meaning of poetic metaphors, metaphors of personal identification, and sublime feeling. So we'll go through each of those in context. Okay. All right. So I.A. Richards, one of the first to talk about this notion of interaction, proposed that these varied powers of poetic metaphor depend on interaction between the metaphoric topic and vehicle, or vehicle and topic. And it wasn't just Richards. Besides I.A. Richards, there was also Black and Ricoeur, and even more recently, Fauconnier and Turner, Goodblack and Gleason, and really looking at this contrast between this bidirectional interaction between the vehicle and topic. And I'll go through an example of what that looks like in a second. But basically, the idea here is that this is selective identification of attributes of the vehicle and topic that were not previously salient for either alone. And this together can create a sort of emergent meaning between the vehicle and topic. So this comes from the Katz and other norms originally. Prayer is grief flying. So we'll use this example to give you a sense of what this interaction kind of looks like, and also to eventually talk about in our methods how we tried to capture this interaction. So with a metaphor like prayer is grief flying, it's not just the attributes of grief flying that impact the reading of prayer, which is a common way of looking at metaphor understanding, but also that there's also an impact of prayer on grief flying. So taken together, they come together to create an overall appreciation for a certain kind of metaphor. And there's the goal of this report presentation is to look at a couple of different studies to help get a better understanding of what this bidirectional interaction can look like, and even to go a bit beyond just the understanding of the metaphor itself. So this includes the integration of some of the specific attributes with that A is a B, B is an A type metaphoric statement, as I mentioned earlier. But we're also interested in looking at some of the evoked personal memories, metaphors of personal identification, and sublime feeling. And again, I'll go into these concepts again in a bit more detail shortly. But the basic idea is that with metaphors of personal identification, it's the right is to say I am something. So you really identify in that sense with the content of the metaphor. And sublime feeling, so a specific kind of aesthetic response. So these are focal and are unpacking of the study. So as I mentioned before, this is a follow-up talk that's based on what Professor Kuiken talked about with a PDP model, a kind of neural network processing. And basically what was found in that particular study was kind of using that modeling technique through the hidden units. They were able to identify a certain kind of interaction that was of interest. And in particular, what really stands out here is the bidirectional relations between the average of A as a B metaphors and the average of B as an A explicative statements. So this AB-BA interaction. So that becomes important as well because this is central in the path analysis that I'll be showing the social equational modeling. And particularly, there's 4 specific bidirectional statements that matter that involved this A as a B, B as an A integrative interaction. And these predicted the average ratings of metaphors of personal identification, something that is explicit in the model that I'll be showing you shortly. And also, what I'll be highlighting is that this particular A as a B, B as an A integrative interaction is kind of built right into the SEM model. So kind of interesting driving force earlier on in the model. So as was first discussed in part 1, in our methods, we use the conversation of prayers, which you would have noticed from, some of you may have seen from the Katz and et al. Metaphor selection earlier. And it comes from this passage, really. And this is part of what it is that participants read during the study. So the conversation of prayers about to be said turns in the dark on the sound they know will arise into the answering skies from the green ground, from the man on the stairs and the child by his bed. The sound about to be said in the 2 prayers for the sleep in a safe land and the love who dies will be the same grief flying. So prayer is grief flying, or sometimes all prayer is grief flying, or all prayer is the same grief flying, is the metaphor that's pulled out of this particular passage. So they actually read this passage, and it the context does seem to matter. One of the things we want to make sure that we included to have in the excerpt. There is a kind of personal note, I think, fairly clearly in the way that this passage or excerpt reads. Okay, methods. An online session involved reading and rereading the poem, completion of a questionnaire that assessed explication of the poetic metaphor, again from that Katz et al. Passage or selection. Separate sets of items enabled access to evidence of bidirectional interplay. So the A is B, prayer is grief flying, and B is A. Grief flying is prayer. And the metaphoric self-identification. So things like I am prayer, I am grief flying. Another object of interest for aesthetic interest is sublime feeling. So in particular, we're looking at sublime disquietude as an aesthetic response. It's a form of poignantly mixed feelings. So 2 different things fit together for this experience. One, the disquietude of discourse and the exhilaration of release. So I'll say that in a slightly different way. And that is when we actually utilize this in questionnaires. It comes from 3 subscales. The interactive combination of these 3 subscales. And sublime feeling as disquietude then is looked at as disquietude, expressive realizations, and self-perceptual depth. So some examples for each of those. For the first, disquietude, while reading this passage, I felt profoundly ill at ease. And expressive realizations. While reading this passage, I began to understand something that could not be put into words. And self-perceptual depth. After reading this poem, I felt sensitive to aspects of my life that I usually ignore. So it's a combination of these things that lead to this sublime feeling. So I know this, so study 1, this is the structural equation model from that study. I know that it looks quite complex. But we'll go through this in a couple of different stages, so you can see what's most important, or at least what we're focusing on primarily. So I know I said before there were a few different variables that came out of part 1 of this study, and that involved loneliness, invocation, and what seems impossible. So two different combinations of these interactions end up being especially important for the structural equation model, especially as follow the path. Again, I'll point that out momentarily. And here are some examples of how we captured loneliness, invocation, and invocation. So metaphorically, prayer occurs in loneliness is one of the rated items. Metaphorically, grief flying is an invocation. Metaphorically, by virtue of bidirectional interaction, prayer and grief flying are in loneliness and invocation is the take home. There's a way in which it's derived from these other components. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to point out was that so you have these A is B averages, and the B is A averages. So and then they lead to these particular variables of interest, the ones that seem to drive part of the process in part 1 of the study, also inform the cross product, the overall cross product in this particular model. And probably of even more interest, you'll notice that there are the variables over here that we really care about, and I'll get into more detail momentarily. But you have a personal memory, I am prayer, so this I am grief, and I am grief like prayer. So these are the metaphors of personal identification. This is the readiness to say that I am these things. And then sublime feeling. So the cross product, we saw kind of that kind of the linchpin in the middle of the model there of A is B and B is A, predicts the elicitation of a personal memory. So the just respondents saying that there was a memory that came to mind. And these in turn predict the readiness to say I am grief like prayer. I am grief predicts I am prayer, and I am grief like prayer, and I am grief like prayer predicts sublime feeling. I know that seems like a lot of pathway discussion, so I'll show you beyond just the writing what this looks like. So you'll see that I kind of have these coefficients in red as well. So here's kind of the linchpin. The A is B, B is A cross product. That predicts a personal memory. It also predicts I am grief, by the way, which is an interesting correspondence, an interesting interaction in its own right. But really predicts this personal memory, which predicts I am grief like prayer, and I am grief. And I am grief like prayer predicts sublime feeling. Okay. Study 2. So this is to demonstrate that it's the same model. And again, as with the first study, the loneliness invocation interaction and the loneliness impossible interaction seem to be important for kind of an important part of the process as a follow-up to the first study. Again, these examples, metaphorically, prayer occurs in loneliness, metaphorically, grief flying is asking for is impossible, and this kind of combination through this bidirectional interaction, prayer and grief flying are asking in loneliness for what seems impossible. Okay, step 2. So you see this the pattern is replicated again in the loneliness invocation and the loneliness impossible. So here's a difference between the two different studies. And I'll point this out with the laser pointer again. Sorry, this takes a little bit of getting used to doing this presentation with PowerPoint. I do kind of like the laser pointer. Sorry, I digress. Yes, so this is a cross product in the middle of the model. The predicts readiness to say I am prayer. But you don't get the I am grief-like prayer, or I am grief, for that matter, in this particular model. So we'll talk about what that might mean in a second, but I'll also show what this means again in the overall diagram. Say it a couple of different ways. But this right is to say that I am prayer still predicts I am grief, and I being able to say I am grief predicts I am grief-like prayer. So that's also useful, right? Because it's now a kind of a replicated finding, that you have this process essentially, right? Where you go from saying I am prayer to I am grief to I am grief-like prayer. This readiness to do so. Which once you get to the place, if you get to the place where you can say I am grief-like prayer, you get also to the sense of sublime feeling. So it's an interesting correspondence in that regard as well. So again, you have A is B, B is A cross product, and the main difference here, everything else is the same, essentially. But the main difference here is that when you get to personal memory, you can't get directly to I am grief like prayer or to I am grief. You do get to I am prayer, so it's significant in this study. And from I am prayer, you can see you can get to I am grief like prayer and sublime feeling. So there's a couple of different systems in play. It's a fairly complex model. I know that I'm sure when you first look at this, you think, wow, there's a lot going on. But I do want to encourage you to basically keep three things in mind. One, everything starts with these average ratings of the A is B, B is A, all surrounded, all involving this prayer is grief flying, or grief flying is prayer. And this kind of, you get to the cross product, which leads to, or the interaction between the term, how these two sets of ratings interact with each other, which leads to personal memory being elicited. In the second study, it leads to I am prayer, which leads to I am grief like prayer, which leads to sublime feeling. In the first study, it didn't lead to I am prayer, but the other two instead. So I am grief like prayer and I am grief. So there's still a connection in both cases here between the personal memory and getting to sublime feeling. But the path is a little bit different between this one and study one. Basically what we get here is that this model describes in greater resolution how the emergent meanings of poetic metaphors affect personal memory during reading, and how these emergent meanings lead to moving or aesthetic effects, the sublime. So probably the most important thing for us to worry about, especially in regards to the personal memories, that was the kind of the complicated finding, right? Where there was a couple of different ways that personal memories can feed into the model. And that is changing the way that we assess the elicitation of personal memories. So basically, in the study that we have so far, we're just asking, basically asking whether people had a personal memory come to mind. But of course, that's a pretty superficial way of looking at how memory might be implicated here. So one of the next steps is to kind of create a subset of questions that better query the nature both of the elicitation and the quality of the personal memory. Because we want to know, it'd be nice to know what more about what seemed to bring this memory out, if people have anything to add to that. Or at the very least, to have a better sense of what that memory is like. Other qualities of that memory. That might allow us to have a better understanding of how we get to prayer or grief or what have you. Obviously, people have different experiences, and this as a context is something that's of interest for us to better understand how this feeds into the metaphors of personal identification and ultimately to the aesthetic feeling of the sublime. All right, so thank you very much for your time, everyone, and I hope everyone is having a great time at a virtual conference. This is my first time at a virtual conference, so hopefully that went okay for everyone. Thanks again.